week when we were together, we looked at the development in the Middle Ages of reform movements and of different kinds. Some of these reform movements were of a lay character, and two in particular, the Albigensians and the Waldensians, became heretical movements in the church. Also at this time, there's a new type of religious life that emerges, which we call mendicancy. And the two big figures in that movement, there are others as well, is St. Francis of Assisi and St. Dominic de Guzman, which found the Franciscan and the Dominican order. And this influences not only the way the church is going to minister, but also the way the church is going to organize certain of its personnel, because these mendicants will be directly under the Pope, not under a bishop, and they will be at the disposal of the Pope to engage in many different missions for them. They'll also become in the vanguard of the intellectual life. The Fourth Lateran Council, which is very significant in trying to reform the church again and again and again, confirms a lot of these movements and condemns them as well. So, but we saw that the church, if you will, was pulling together and renewing itself, but then it ends in this crisis of the Great Western Schism. And that's where we left off last week, was looking at a divided church. And in the language of history, the church divides itself into two obediences: the obedience of Avignon and the obedience of Rome. Just to refresh our memory of how this evolves, that the Pope had been residing in France for 7 years, and they were French nationality, and were highly influenced in good ways and maybe less than good ways by the King of France. And so those who were against this referred to it as the French captivity, or the Babylonian captivity is sometimes called. Now, after this 70-year period, and we will encounter her tonight more fully, St. Catherine of Siena, with the intuitions of a mystical intuition, she actually goes to Avignon and convinces the Pope at the time that this situation is untenable, that he's the Bishop of Rome, he's got to come to Rome, the center of the papacy, and because it's in a shambles. And she convinces him to do this. Looks like things are looking up. He comes to Rome, takes possession of the see, which remember he had not been in Rome for a long time, for 7 years, and immediately dies, which leaves them kind of high and dry, shall we say. So the effect of this, they had to have another papal election. And clearly the papal court that's in Rome, the curia, is chaotic. So they elect a pope who is by temperament a severe reformer, and he comes down like a ton of bricks on them, including the cardinals that elected him, and starts to trim their feathers as well. So their response to this is they get up, go back to Avignon, and they elect another pope. Okay? So the one that stays in Rome is the direct successor of the popes that have all come before. Remember, this situation is unique, different from the time when the Emperor Frederick appointed a pope. Because here, the actual people who elected the pope now elect another pope. And so there's all kinds of questions about legitimacy. And both of them get 2/3 votes. So they fill all these canons. So we have these contenders there. As this evolves through the years with these two popes, the alliances to which one or the other are more involved with politics and economic interests than theological interests. And something I want to point out here, and we'll come back to this later next class when we look at the papacy, that during this time, and what comes after, none of these popes ever dealt with anything of a doctrinal nature that was against the creed or the faith of the church. They never taught wrong things. It was just about governance that these issues were about, but they never questioned any doctrine of the faith or anything like that. It was not, which to me says, thank God for the Holy Spirit. If you haven't read the book, you should. Okay? So here's the situation. So just to give you an example of what I mean by political alliances, look at Scotland. Scotland aligns itself with Avignon. And the main reason they do that is because England aligns itself with Rome. And Wales goes back and forth trying to preserve its interests as it goes. So the reality is not like one's holding the doctrine that Jesus is something and another one's holding another view. It's just a political alliance. And this is straining Europe terribly. This affects all kinds of things. And so there's a growing spirit, not only among politicians, but also ecclesiastical people, including the cardinals, who by this time, each pope has elected been appointing their own college of cardinals because time has passed, and the original group that elected the first two, they're passed on to other rewards because well, maybe they had to spend a little time on the way there. But people began to discuss within the church. Remember, there's this large theological community now that has developed in the universities, and so people are proposing, how can we get this thing resolved? And so I've kind of put it, and this is my schema here of 1, 2, 3. But solution one was, we'll get both of them to resign, and then we'll elect a new person. And then it's over. We don't have to say who's right, who's wrong. We just get rid of them both. The problem is neither one of them are interested in that solution. So that they said, let's forget that. The second solution proposed by different ecclesiastical theologians say, well, when one dies, we'll align ourselves to the survivor. But the problem, neither one of them want to die. So we're stuck there. They can't get off center with this thing. And it seems like both of these men are quite vigorous. And when we look at their actual lifespan, that this would have continued on for decades because they were quite healthy people. The third solution was discussed among ecclesiastics, princes, and theologians, would be to call a council of the church to resolve the system. And neither pope had the authority to do this. It was part of their problem. And by this stage, the idea that had existed in the early church that emperors could convoke councils, or as in the case of Empress Irene, she calls the council, that idea had long passed in the century. And more with claims of people like Boniface VIII and Innocent III of the central powers of the papacy, it wasn't even considered that you could get somebody there. And by this time, Europe has different power centers, and younger politicians, the kings or emperor-type people, would be able to have the clout to do that. So they're kind of stuck there, because which pope is going to call the council to get rid of the other one? It's going to be a problem. So a theory comes about, and it's called conciliarism, and they said the council is the supreme authority of the church. And so if we call a council, if we can get a council going, we can deal with this. And the council will be above these two characters. So this is spread in university faculties. People are speculating about this. Now, the German emperor, just got there. Yeah. No, we got to go this way. I'm going too far. I messed this up, Corey. Let's go back. Stuff you over. Fine. Okay. So now, the cardinals of both groups are sick of the children. So this Pope Clement and Pope Benedict, Gregory and Benedict, they're all of them decide we're going to have a meeting in Pisa. Pisa was chosen because it was kind of halfway. It is a sea city. It's on the sea where the Arno River enters the Mediterranean, so people could come by sea to the council and they could come by land. And at this time, this grand church is being built and it has reached the second level. It has like a flat wooden roof at this time. It's not completed yet. The tower's not there and the baptistry is not there. But it's in construction, and so the view is it could hold such a meeting. And so the cardinals come together on June 5th, 1409, with a number of bishops and theologians and heads of religious orders, and they depose both of the popes. They said, both of you are no longer pope. You're deposed. And they elect this very, very holy man who is the Archbishop of Milan. He's not into any kind of power games. He's done wonders for the Diocese of Milan. There's a great spiritual fervor there. And so it's just an exemplar place to be, and he's an exemplar bishop. So they elect him, and he takes the name Alexander V. But what they don't realize that his health is very fragile, and within a year he's dead. And now we have 3 popes going on, and they all refuse to resign. So the cardinals come together again, and they elect a new pope who takes the name John the 23rd. Have you ever heard of him?
Yes.
No, you didn't. We know John the 23rd of our time, who was elected in 1958. So John the 23rd has got the support of both of these camps. But now we got 3 of them. So this is a real problem. And so the German king, who has claimed the title Holy Roman Emperor, but he has not been crowned and anointed as such, but he's operating as if he is, Sigismund, he insists that John the 23rd call a council of the church. And he proposes that it be held in the city of Constance, which is in Switzerland, the German part of Switzerland. He makes a big argument for it. He says it's a very safe place. We're far away from France and we're far away from Italy, so this is kind of like a neutral zone. And he describes the city, and he says it's a beautiful, tranquil place on a marvelous lake, and he describes the sunset and all this kind of stuff. He said it will lift up their spirits to be more aware of the whole spiritual and sacred role of it. So it's gonna be there. So 300 cardinals and bishops go to the council from all over the church, plus 300 theologians. It's the first council there, as many theologians as there are Episcopal people there. And then there's some lords that come and some priests, members of these religious orders. There's the Franciscans are there, Dominicans are there, Norbertines, and some abbots come as well. But there are also other people who arrive. Large numbers of pickpockets, prostitutes, vendors of all kinds, people who traffic in false relics are selling all kinds of parts of God or Bezel. And so pretty soon, this marvelous place has turned into kind of a sin pit. And the people of Constance can't wait for this thing to get over, to get these people out of town. Probably even throwing paper on the street. So it was bad. But the real secret purpose of the council was to remove all 3 of these popes and begin another effort to start over. And through a lot of different things, but the express purpose of the council was threefold: resolve the schism, deal with some heretical situations in the church and to reform the clergy. In fact, they never got to the reform thing because the other issues took them so long. But during the council, they were able, through a lot of different maneuvers, very clever maneuvers, to get all three to resign. They all resigned. The one from Rome says he will not resign at a council because this is not a council. He's the true pope, and he has to call the council. But John the 23rd had already called the council. So they said, okay, we'll let you convoke the council again. So he proclaims the council now. So he says, now this is a real council, and now I'll resign. So there's all kinds of things being settled this way, including a promise that they would be treated mercifully after the council is over. And when Martin V does get elected, he reigns for a long time, so it gives us some stability there. He's very generous to them. He gives them each a bishopric that they can have. And John the 23rd ultimately will be given this an area in Tuscany near Siena, and he's buried in the Cathedral of Siena. So you go there and you see the tomb of John the 23rd there, but it says also the claim to be in. And these they're called anti-popes. But it resolves this thing, and they have a papal election, and Martin becomes the pope. So voila, finally, we're back to one pope.
How many years was that?
But the period?
The period where we had 2 and then 3 and then...
About 40 years.
40 years.
40 years.
So we've got the 5th, we got the 23rd, we got all these people. So in the church numbering system of these popes,
yes, that's
do any of them actually exist as a...
No. And the official list of popes, the anti-popes are not listed. But there's a couple of anomalies. Remember, the first piece of pope was Alexander V? Well, but later on, when Borgia is elected pope, he wants to take the name Alexander. But at this time, the list hasn't cleaned up, so he takes Alexander VI. But if you look at the official list of pope, there's a 4th and a 6th, but there's no 5th there. But all these names that are taken, there's a Benedict XIII, okay? And he's set aside, and John the 23rd is set aside. So when Angelo Roncalli gets elected pope in 1958, and he says he wants to take the name John, they said, well, you're going to be John the 23rd. And so that's who he was, you know. And because this John the 23rd here is not recognized as a legitimate pope. Why? Because the insistence upon apostolic succession. And so if you remember the story from Avignon to Rome, and most probably all the popes that were elected in Rome will be legitimate ones, and then Martin V takes over there. And the other claim, all the ones that were up in Avignon post-return, and Pisa, we call anti-popes. But never again would the church find itself in this situation where there would be many different popes this way. But they have other business to attend to. In England, a gentleman had lived, he had died at the time of Council of Constance. John Wycliffe is said, there's a number of ways it's pronounced. And he was a sincere man in my belief. I always give these people the benefit of the doubt, that they were always nice people. But they're heretics. But anyway, he began to challenge some very fundamental things about the beliefs of the church, because he was a reformer. And he wanted to see the church purified. And he saw so much of the corruption tied up with beliefs and practices of the church. So he begins to challenge the validity of the sacraments and the claims of authority within the church. And his fundamental position was, if the clergy, if a bishop, a priest, or a deacon are morally corrupt, that the powers that were given to them through ordination are suspended. That they're no longer valid. They lose their authority. And a lot of these ideas that he emerged. And if you remember in the last class, I said the Mundingans kind of did something to the theology of holy orders, because you always have to have a community for a priest, and now they're being ordained to power. So they don't have any community. So he gets into all these things, and the council takes up his situation, and they condemn 58 of his propositions. Now, today, if we, as historians, if we look at the document of the Council of Constance and what they said he taught, I would say safely 50 of these were things he held. But about 8 of them are a little bit caricatures. And that sometimes happens, you know. But after you've been wrong 50 times, what's the difference if you got to do that? But he would make claims that the Pope, who falsely claims himself the servant of God's servants, has no status in the work of the gospel, but only the work of the world. If he has any rank, it is in the order of demons, of those who serve God rather than blameworthy lives. The Pope does not dispense from simony or from rash vows, since he is the chief Simonite of all, who rashly vows to preserve to his damnation the status of the way things are. Now, remember, the council, his aim was to straighten some of these things out. Oral confession to priests, introduced by Innocent, which I'll come back to later, is not a necessary it's Latin on the side of it. People, not necessary to people as he claimed. For anyone who offends his brother in thought, word, or deed, then it suffices to repent in thought, word, and deed. So the idea of going to confession, he denies. He will claim that the Eucharist, because it is bread and wine, and that's what it is. It's the substance is what it is. So he denies the real presence. So all of these things are condemned by the council. Now he's dead. So the council instructs that his bones are to be dug up and destroyed and hidden so nobody can find them. They don't want any kind of cult developing with him. Now this is in England. Now it's not, doesn't take over all of England, but it's going on there. The King of England gets married to a princess from Bohemia, which today is Czech Republic. And so she goes to England to the court. And of course, which was the custom of the times, when these political marriages were made, they just didn't send her by herself. She brought the court with her. And in the more later centuries again, if you go to France and you see Versailles, but there's also Fontainebleau for the Queen. Now they held court in their own sphere. So she brings a great entourage with her. And so she is exposed to these ideas and her court. But also at this time, a man named John Hus, he is developing theories and he's being influenced by these thoughts. Now they're not alive. He's not alive. John Hus is there, and he has his prodigy student Jerome of Prague. And so he builds on Wycliffe's thought, and he rejects the notion of the papacy completely and its governance over the church. And he has a long list of things, and one of the most terrible things he says is the Dominicans and the Franciscans are created by the devil. Never done enough to do him in. So, trying to resolve it. Now he's alive. The political powers guarantee him safe passage to come to Constance. So he travels from Prague to Constance, where his thoughts were going to be heard out and so forth, and try to resolve this problem. Well, the Pope changes his mind and reneges on the deal. So he has John arrested, and he's brought to the council, and he's tried, he's found guilty, and he's burnt to death. And so is that the end of John Hus? No. He becomes a martyr to his followers, and as we saw with the early church, in the early centuries, there's nothing like killing people for what they believe to spread it further. So he becomes a hero, and to this day, we still have Hussites in the world. And so, and in Prague, he's honored as kind of a hero for his convictions. But he gets burnt, and all of his positions are condemned and so forth. And really, in Bohemia, they're really not brought to heel, if that's your view, they should have been, until the Counter-Reformation by the Jesuits. It persists very strongly in Bohemia. So there he goes. And this leads us to something that we really didn't bring up. We talked about the foundation of the Dominicans and the Franciscans and so forth. And remember the dates. Francis is 1212, Dominic is 1216. And both of these orders are flourishing, and they're counteracting the heretics through their preaching and example. But Pope Gregory IX feels that things are not progressing well. So he institutes the Inquisition, and it's the Holy Roman Inquisition. And this is important you hear that title, the Roman Inquisition, because later on we're going to hear of another Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, but they're distinct from each other. And it's an institution, and it has a charter, and there's very specific ways that people who hold heresies are to be treated. There's a great deal of technical, procedural things that must be followed. In particular, language. There's kind of a conviction of language that has to, what things mean must be very precise in the process. There's also a legal method here, a defense. You have a right to someone to help you, a theologian to help you along, and things of this sort. Something that is not so good is you don't know who your accuser is. And to this day, the Congregation of the Faith will accept anonymous accusations against theologians, which I find a little problematic for me. But what would happen to you if you were found guilty? You were given what they call spiritual remedies. You would maybe be told to fast. You were told you cannot go to the sacraments for a time. The worst thing that happened to you, you got excommunicated. But they were all, if you will, of a spiritual nature. But, and they were staffed mainly by the Franciscans and the Dominicans. And just as kind of an aside there, the Dominicans, this is where we got this name of the Lord's hounds or the Lord's watchdogs. In Latin, Dominicans are Dominicani. Cani is dogs. Domini is Lord, the Lord's dogs. And so they were considered kind of the hounds to go out there. And you'll see a lot in medieval art and Renaissance art. Usually in the lower part of painting, you'll see wolves kind of like attacking the saints, and these black and white dogs biting the heck out of them. They usually go for their throat, in the pictures of them. We're not like that, really. We're much more wussy than that. But as things developed, and not too much long after the institution of the Inquisition, things were, it was too soft, and people were going back in their wicked ways. So the Pope gave a directive that physical pressure could be brought in the use of imprisonment, torture, or even execution. But the church could not do these things because it was contrary to the gospel. So if a person was convicted of heresy, they would be given to the civil authorities who would then implement the penalty. So all the torture and so on. If you ever see pictures with priests torturing people, that's kind of Hollywood. So, and the argument for this was heresy was not only a religious sin, but it was a civil crime. And in a world where economics, politics, religion, everything is integrated into a worldview, heresies were socially disruptive. And they could tear cities apart and whole areas. So it was in the interest of both the government and the church to get a solution here. sometimes you'll see pictures of St. Francis, St. Dominic, of being inquisitors. Neither one of them ever were part of the Inquisition. They were dead by that time. But certainly their sons were. And the Roman Inquisition existed until about 1990. 1890. No, right before, at the end of Pius IX's term, the Inquisition as that ends. There was still a holy office that dealt with doctrinal matters, which they still have. But the Inquisition as an institution gets disbanded. Okay?
Made it all the way to the New World, right?
Yeah, that's the Spanish Inquisition.
The Spanish.
And the Roman Inquisition never comes to be annexed. So what is this legal process? First of all, there has to be a charge of teaching error. Okay? Now, all of us, except my brother here, Corey, because he's truly a pure heart. But all of us, theologically, most wholesome errors. We don't have something straight in our mind about our faith. And we most probably don't even know it. To give you an example, in my family, if you have a religious in your family, you can be kind to them and not discuss religion with them when they come to visit you. But that's usually what happens to us. This is an occasion for a theological seminar. So when you come home, everybody wants to talk religion because they think that's all you're interested in. You can't even get a Super Bowl story out of them. But one time, it comes up in my family. My niece, who's in high school, Catholic high school, they're talking about the Assumption of Mary into heaven. And she's saying that you've got to believe that if you're a Catholic. And people, oh, no. Well, her grandmother on the paternal side says to her, but no, you don't. That's why we call it the Assumption, because we just assume. Now, I mean, this is a good Catholic lady all of her life, devoted to the church, but she's got an error there, you know. But all of us have mistakes in notions about things. But when people have a position and they start to promulgate, then this becomes a concern or even a threat. So when this is done, that somebody's accused of error, it requires a formal investigation. And in the Inquisition, it required written statements, not just what so-and-so said. And very happily, I have to say, the notes of a professor's students could not be used against them. So I'm saying something, but I don't know what you're writing down. You know? So that was not considered evidence. It had to be from your own hand, something that you wrote out that was an error. And so somebody accuses you of he wrote this article in such and such a journal. Okay? So it's from your own pen. And today in the church, with modern media, YouTube and all that, how does one control all of that? Where in the printed media it was containable, if you will. So there's an informal investigation. Theologians would look into these matters, and the person would be called in, and there would be a discussion, a dispute about instructing them what they're doing wrong. They could argue back and forth how they were coming to this. You don't understand what I'm saying, and this and that and the other, and so forth and so on. And sometimes they were exonerated, and they said, well, yeah, just try to say it a little bit better. Clear up this particular part, and you're fine. But other times, they would not. And so they would say, you're wrong. You're told no longer to say this anymore. And you have to do this kind of a penance, maybe go on a retreat or something like that. Or possibly even be tutored by somebody more enlightened than yourself. And that would be the end of it if the person stopped holding this error and spreading it. But if the person continued to persist in this error, he was considered lax. And that was not a good thing to be. So there, the Inquisition came down hard on you, and you were pushed to recant it. If you refused to recant, you were condemned as a heretic. Okay, and now a heretic is a term in Catholicism used again in a very technical way. A heretic is a person who tenaciously clings to error. And you say, well, what is tenaciously clinging? The Inquisitor knows tenaciously clinging. He decides. this, okay? And so this person is declared a heretic, and depending on the gravity of this, is turned over to the civil authorities for condemnation, which would include being killed. And a type of, if you will, kind of a liturgy develops called the auto de fe, where these are public things that are held in the squares, and these people are brought out, the charges against them are on them, and then they're burnt alive. So people, and it's the beginning of hell for the empire. The future is being illustrated to the Christian community because the belief is held as fiery burners, and so we just light them up now and get them started. And again, reference to Hollywood, if you've ever saw, those of you who are my age, Ingrid Bergman and Joan of Arc, and she's getting cooked there as well. She was accused of heresy, but her offense, which she gets convicted of, is that she was told not to wear men's clothes. And she went back and did it again. She lapsed back when she led the army into battle. She put men's clothes back on. She cut her hair like a man. And that's ultimately what she did. The Inquisition dealt with all kinds of stuff. So it was mainly a theological thing, but it dealt with all kinds of disciplinary problems. Priests who violated children were brought before the Inquisition and were burnt to death for that. And all these kind of things were dealt with by the Inquisition. And it was quite a thing. And people feared the Inquisition, the Inquisitor. And if you're a literature person, you know that different characters appear in the Great Inquisitor, and yike, here it comes. So that's kind of where the church is operating in terms of its formal theology. But something else has happened. Rolling back the clock to the Fourth Lateran Council, which is in 1215. In Canon 21, the council gives a precept of like an obedience that you must obey. It's not like a doctrine of faith. It could change. It can be lifted off and on again. But this council says all the faithful of either sex, after they have reached the age of discernment, should individually confess all their sins in a faithful manner to their own priest at least once a year. At that time, the practice of the church was 12 years old, was the age of discernment. That's when you made communion. It was lowered in the 20th century to 7. Okay. Let them take care to do what they can to perform a penance imposed upon them. Let them reverently receive the sacrament of the Eucharist at least at Easter, unless they think for a good reason they should, and on the advice of a priest they should not. So the laity now must receive communion at least once a year during the Easter season, and they must confess their sins once a year. Today in the canon it says they must confess their sins once a year if they have committed a serious sin. And that's in the Code of Canon Law. It's kind of a juridical thing, but the effect of this is it brings the laity closer to the Eucharist and receiving the Eucharist. So it increases the reverence and adoration for the Holy Eucharist, and most people don't settle for once a year. They're more and more inclined toward this. And so the lay spirituality is more and more becoming sacramental. It's very much closer to that. And corresponding to this now, as this thing is developing, and there are many of these. I'm going to cite one because it ultimately has such a great impact upon the church. There's also what we call popular religion, stories that people know of, and it encourages them in their faith. There's a little town on Lake Bolzano in central Italy. It's a beautiful little lake, and it has the sweetest fish ever. They have a little St. Peter fish, and they're just cooked delicious. They catch them right there and cook them right from the restaurant. So I always like to put out certain menus too, because you never know when you're going to get there. But according to this story, a priest from Bohemia is on pilgrimage with a group going to Rome. Now remember, they can't go to the Holy Land, so Rome becomes a big center for pilgrimage for people. Well, if you can't go to where Jesus was, at least you can go where the apostles were. So he's on pilgrimage, and they stop at Bolzano, and he's going to say Mass in this little church. It's still there. But the problem with this priest is he doesn't believe in the real presence of Jesus. And maybe he was affected by the sex, we don't know. We don't know that a lot about it. But anyway, when he sang Mass, at the time when the priest breaks the host in two, just like we do today, blood drops from the host onto this little white cloth, which is called a corporal. And this corporal gets stained with this blood. It's moved from the little town to this, which is the bishopric, this wonderful city of Orvieto, which is this magnificent church there. A special chapel is built, and the corporal is put into a reliquary. There's an actual picture of it there. In the stains, you can see them through the glass. And there's this great devotion to this corporal in this town, and also the Holy Eucharist. And so it becomes a great local feast, which is prayer, processions, and feast, of course. Orvieto is noted for two great things. It has Orvieto Classico. It's a lovely, fresh, white wine. It's an October wine. It's lovely. And there's a particular mushroom there that is very savory and soily. And in autumn, if you go to Orvieto and you have a nice pasta with that mushroom and that white wine, your spirits bubbles. And so it's something to know. But so this feast is growing. St. Thomas Aquinas, who has been teaching at the seminary studium in Rome, is transferred up to Orvieto, where we have a big house of studies there. And he's supposed to kind of like organize the faculty. And he gets caught up in this feast. And he writes a Mass for Corpus Christi. Part of that Mass, in the middle of the Mass, a sequence he writes, which is called the Plungilingua. If you go to benediction or adoration, there's two verses we sing, that was O Salutaris and the Cantamerico. You know those two verses? Sometimes you can sing them in English, but it's a long, long song where it's sung always is on Holy Thursday. When the Blessed Sacrament is moved from the altar to the repository, we sing the Lingua Gloriosi, and there's an English verse of it too. And it's celebrating the doctrine of transubstantiation. So this feast of Corpus Christi starts off as a local thing, and it spreads and it spreads and it spreads and it spreads, and ultimately it becomes a feast of the universal church. So the Sunday after Trinity Sunday is the feast of Corpus Christi. Now, in different places, different times, different cultures, it involves huge processions in the streets, altars, and maybe some of you where you were raised. Where I was raised, this was a big, big feast day. And it was, again, prayers and meals all combined there. It was a great feast there. But this it's part of this great movement of the emphasis on the Holy Eucharist there. And there are many other, if you travel through Europe, they'll say there was a miracle here, a miracle there with the Eucharist, or sometimes healings and things of this sort. But this particular one has an impact on the whole church. Another development is taking place, and it's rooted in a lot of these spiritual moments. But there are a number of holy men and women who began to record their, what we would call subjective experiences of God in the form of a teaching or a witnessing, a type of writing, a spiritual teaching or spiritual witnessing, recording. And some of these experiences involve what we call extraordinary graces, things like which the church teaches are given to some people as a gift for the whole church, for our edification. So things like receiving the stigma of the wounds of Jesus on their body. St. Francis of Assisi receives these, and others. They have visions of saints of Jesus, the Blessed Mother. They'll have conversations with Jesus or with other saints as well. And they record these into writings. And this mystical theology becomes very influential in people's lives. Catherine de Siena, the woman who's a laywoman who goes to get the Pope back to Rome, she is in this mystical school. She's considered a doctor of the church. Julian of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, a lot of these women of this period, or some of them are nuns and some of them are lay people. Catherine de Siena actually was a lay Dominican. She was not a nun like that. Interesting person, the 23rd child of her family. The family wanted to marry her off. She doesn't want to, and she has visions. And ultimately, her great work is called The Dialogue, where she has these conversations with Jesus. And part of that relationship, she actually marries Jesus. It's very real. I mean, when Jesus marries her, he takes his foreskin and gives it to her as a wedding ring. And there's all kinds of imagery and stuff. So it's a very rich literature and from many different angles. Also, you have men. You have people like Meister Eckhart and Risuso and other mystical men. And these are in German. Okay, they're all over Europe. Thomas à Kempis is in the Low Countries, which are part of what would today be the Netherlands. Many of these people were canonized later by the church as saints. You might have known Thomas à Kempis by his work, The Imitation of Christ. Have you ever bumped into that? Now, Thomas à Kempis never got canonized. Do you know why? Does anybody know why? There's nothing wrong with his writings. Accidentally, he was buried alive. And when they exhumed him to start to canonize him a saint, they saw that he had scratched the top of the coffin and smelled it to death, and they don't know, well, did he despair at the end, or did he keep his faith? So they will never canonize him. But when we were young brothers, periodically parts of that were read to us, and we'd say, what's next? What do we have to do next? And they say, oh, it's readings from. And a little cue there that we were scratching away. But this body of literature develops, and it's a vast development. It's so developed. The Paulist fathers, in the last 20 years or so, developed a publication series called Classics of Western Spirituality. And I mean, it's like a lot of volumes. And they've taken these writings of all these different mystical people and translated them into good English with an introductory, and these are very, very popular today. And later mystics as well, people like Priest of Avila, John the Cross, and all these people, just probably yeah. And we don't have all of them, but we have many of them, and the librarian are going to be ordering books. I should tell you that if there's books you would like it to see. I also bought this book here, which is a retrospect back. This book is called The Death Penalty, and it's really, the purpose of the book is to look at the issue today. But it's a historical theological study. Look at the size of it. And in the early parts here, it really explains how the church ultimately gets into the imposition and the justification of use of torture and death and all of these things. And so if you're interested in how could a church who's founded by Jesus, who says we have to love our enemies, do these things, this gentleman took a great deal of time to chart that out for you. So, and this is in the library here. It's worth the read. I read it 2 years ago, and it's definitely worth the read. We do that. But all of these mystics, the core of their work is, in my own experience, this is what loving union with God means. And they write these things down. Some of them don't want to do it, but their confessors tell them they must do it. They must write these down for the good of the church. And so they write these down. Some of them are not able to write very well, so they have secretaries write for them. And they dictate it. And so this treasury of spiritual theology develops in the church. And it's a whole different thing than systematic theology, where you have a very logical and rational approach to beliefs. And we talk about the relationship between the Father and the Son, and the different roles, and what does redemption mean, and things like transubstantiation. That's all systematic theology. Here, people are talking about, this is how I encountered God. Now, what does the church think of all this? The church very cleverly and tenderly deals with this. We'll look at what they wrote, and we'll say, there is nothing in these writings against the faith. The church will not say, she did get married to Jesus and she's wearing his foreskin. They don't say that. But all of these things, even in our own time when I was a young person, and some of you, Teresa Verezu, who's considered a doctor of the church, she wrote a kind of a meditation called The Little Way. Very, very popular when I was young among people. People used to read that very much. Some of you may have read it as a young person. My sisters encountered it in high school, in those Asian boys and the other, and the sisters there had a very much, and from my sisters I became aware of it, and they used to tell me a little bit what was inside of it. But it was the idea that every little thing we do, the way we dedicate it becomes a part of our holiness in that view there. So beginning at this time, and it's rooted in this, ultimately, this command of a council that people start going to the sacraments more, becoming more, it brings people closer to the life of the church. And then you have this kind of growth there. These people in their lifetime are recognized for their holiness. Many people come to them for spiritual guidance and things of the sort. Coinciding with the mystics and the kind of the sacramental is the beginning of the Renaissance. And a great deal of the artistic development that takes place is sponsored by the church, either materially or spiritually. Sometimes, the princes will be paying the bill, but the church is encouraging this as another form of mystical theology. So you have people like Chinambui, who, if he had followed the course of his family, he was sent to the Dominican school to learn the classics, Latin and theology. He should have been a systematician, but he played hooky and went and found painters to teach him technique, and he's considered one of the greatest artists of all. If we had held on to him, he might have been a good thinker, but he wouldn't have enriched us as much. And you will find his work in the Church of Santa Croce in Florence. Beautiful. And this was damaged by the flood of 67. And there's a book written just about the restoration of this corpse, which is phenomenal, if you're into the fine arts, and I tend to be. We have Fra Angelico, who depicts the story of Jesus and those things to come. And the faces of the people are mystical. They're angelic. That's why they call him brother. His real name is John, the Fiesole. But they call him Fra Angelico because he communicates the mysteries of faith in this kind of angelic light, which inspires people. You have Giotto. Now, Fra Angelico is a Dominican friar. Giotto is really supported, encouraged by the Franciscans. And so if you go to Assisi, in the upper church, unfortunately the earthquake damaged some of these beautiful frescoes of the life of St. Francis. They're just magnificent. He also, and there's an incredible chapel in Padova, up in the north, west of Venice. And in this chapel there that was built for a family, there's the whole life of Christ. And it is unbelievable. It's small, but you'll stay there a day. You just feel like this is a holy place. And so as the Renaissance is beginning and the arts are being promoted, it's correlating with this whole desire for a deeper spiritual, mystical life. And people are edified by it. I know some of you here are going to be going to Europe this summer, and I hope and pray you can go to some of these places when the light is beautiful, because the architecture brings shafts of light into these churches, and you really get a real taste of heaven. There's this wonderful, wonderful chapel at Orvieto by Signorelli, and it's got the Last Judgment in there. And it's not a frightening, there's a frightening scene there, of course. Devils are taking some people away. But the central thing of it is you're swept up into kind of this celestial mode. The light and the color, these beautiful cobalt colors, gold, you get this sense of being swept up with all the holy men and women of God. And you can see that this medium was impacting people spiritually. So,
Where was that one?
in Oviedo. And the Chapel of the Carpels on the left, and this beautiful Chapel of Cinderella is on the right. And in it, especially on a sunny day, you get these shafts of light into these places. So the fine arts, all these things are converging into a very, very rich part of the Christian life. And things are flourishing. Still, people are going to university. Princes are sponsoring church buildings that need to be painted and developed and stuff. So the high Renaissance is evolving. But brakes are put on. And it's a historical medical problem, but it also has an incredible impact on spirituality as well. What happens? The bubonic plague gets loose in Europe. It's contracted, and there's different historical theories, but it comes from trade from different parts of the world. The East was probably Persia, and people don't understand contagion, and it's on the rats of the ship. The lice get on the rats, bite, and they bite people, and it spreads all over the place. The devastation, there's different waves of it and different intensities, and some of the bigger waves of it, half of populations or more are killed. Thousands and thousands of people die from this. Half of the city of London dies. It's incredible. Now, this is a medical thing. So how did the Christian community, first of all, new religious orders are founded. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Election Brothers. St. Alexis founds a group of men who are willing to bury these people because people are scared to bury them. Many of them were just burnt, and that's why some people felt the cities that turned into the tar pits of hell, because there were so many they would just ignite them and bury them. And we've seen that in natural disasters that has had to take place at times. But so the church is, if you will, compassionate and serving, and the Collection Brothers have hospitals, that's their nursing order, and others, the Brothers of St. John of God are founded at this time. But also, there are voices in the church that are saying this is a punishment being sent to God because people are not faithful enough. And there are always lists of sins that we can always point out, even if we can. I'm sure there's a sin city somewhere in here that some good preacher can rise up and rail against. So, and we hear this to this day. In the 1980s, when the AIDS virus was first became, there were church people in our church and others who said this was God's wrath upon people. As recent as this killing up in Connecticut, didn't we have one evangelical preacher said this God's vengeance being visited upon our sinful lives? So I mean, it happens then, but it happens now. But many of these people, these apocalyptic preachers, rose up and said, "It's the end of the world is coming. What can we do?" Well, you're going to have to do penance. So many recommendations, not by the Inquisition outside, but you are to embrace penitential practices. The discipline, this whip, sometimes just rope, sometimes put little gap hooks or little lead balls on it. A person would beat themselves, asking God to purge them of their sin and spare them from the plagues. Okay, and this spreads very much. Because so many people are dying, the church is going to celebrate many masses for the dead. And verses are going to be inserted into the requiem. And again, no show of hands. I don't know anybody can tell their age. But in my time, which is a long time ago, in the last century, after we went to Catholic school, we always started with Mass at 8 o'clock. We were there. And the Mass was in Latin. And it was always a requiem mass because it was a high mass, and they would be in the aisle a coffin with 6 candles, which we always thought there was a body in there, but it was just a box that symbolized the body. And there were all these songs, and we knew the mass by heart. You know, we saw Requiem, And then we went in, when the priest would go down and bless this catafalque, it was called, we would start the song, Dies irae, Dies, O day of wrath, O day of doom. Okay? We didn't know what we were saying. It didn't affect us at all. We were still goofing off and the nuns were smacking us. But can you imagine in a world where people understood that now the voice of the church is saying, a day of wrath, a day of doom. So alongside of all this beautiful, angelic, inspirational art, you have another spiritual tradition coming along and saying, you're in for it, and you better get your act together. So all of this is going on. What a time to live, huh? There's a wonderful book called As in a Distant Mirror. It's a novel, but it brings all these things together in a novel form. It's wonderful. A real good friend of mine, she read it on vacation, and I said, why don't you take that to vacation? She said, it just intrigued me, and she said, I couldn't put it down. She said, what a time to live with all this going on. But it brings us to this reality that at this time, there's a great deal of fermentation throughout the whole church for a new moment. But there's going to be a new moment. It's not going to be quite what some would hope for, though, because we're going to move into the princely popes and the high Renaissance and the Reformation at our next class as we move forward. One of the things I would like you to realize, many Catholics think that the Reformation began with Luther, but these people that we talked about tonight, Hus and Jerome, they were 70 years to 100 years before Luther came along. That these splits were the beginning, but Luther's will be unique in its impact, but some of these separation movements are beginning before that time. And it always brings back to this fundamental question: why do people get into these splits? Why do these things happen? And I believe it's because at historical moments, people can't see the face of Christ in the church. It's a challenge that every day as Catholics we have to push ourselves to make sure that the face of Christ is evident in our personal lives, because otherwise people then see the church as the Church of Jesus, and they start to search. And sometimes where they go is not very helpful for them. And they can become spiritually victimized by getting away from the Christ of the Scripture. So what we see in this period is the challenge for the church to be faithful. Do you have any questions at all? We've covered some big ones, but
Bronner has said that the faith of the future of the church is everybody has to become mystical for the church to survive.
And something, and I've experienced it here with a small group of young men that I have contact with, is a great desire of these young men to have a spirituality, a deeper spirituality. There's a hunger there of young people today. They just don't want formality. They want something. They want something deeper. So that becomes very, very important to them. And so maybe we're in one of these times of one of these revival times of this spirituality as we go along with that here. Yes.
Today I can see, given television and radio and so forth, if you had some theological differences, then you could propagate this and lots of people. Back in those days, so what you didn't believe in transubstantiation? So what that you didn't? Why did that cause communities to have to choose up sides and then try to kill your...
Because the doctrine is never separated from the historical expression, the institutional church. You're not, Catholicism or Christianity is not an abstraction. It always incarnates in history. So if you're holding that this is a symbol and that's all it is, the way the church is going to act out its reverence to what it believes is the true presence
No.
is going to be different than somebody who thinks it's, it's a nice symbol, but, there's no substance there. And that's going to affect the way people act. And then there's going to be challenges because people say, well, you treat the host casually. There's no reverence. Well, that's all it is a piece of bread. It's just a symbol. It's not, you people are going overboard with this. And then that starts clashes and then divisions. And of course, the match that is there that always makes the explosion if you get members of the clergy to back different sides of it. Because we always like the argument of authority to justify us. And so you just need a good black old bishop or a priest to kind of, never a young friar, brother friar. There's never been a brother Bert.
I just wanted to, I remember standing in the girls' choir, and Sister Frances Patricia was knocking on my collarbone to tell me to shut up. We were singing the Mass for the Dead because I was flat. But I had to be there.
Yeah.
Every day, 4th grade through 8th grade.
But I think the intelligibility of Latin in our generation protected us from an exaggerated doom and gloom theology. We didn't really know what it was. It was more, for me, it was more fascination. Where were all these dead people coming from every day?
Yeah, but as an altar boy, you had to go to the house to get the coffee.
Yeah, but this was not a home. It was a catapult.
No, but I mean, when you set the coffin there as a catapult, it was black. Everything was black. The vestments were black.
Oh, sure.
And it was very depressing, to say the least. Very.
But that at this time, this becomes a part, and these historical events, the church is trying to respond to them with a spiritual theological sense out of it, and that flows into practices. So how are people dealing with this? The church will revise the liturgy in a way to deal with this. And so how all this fear, then we offer this Mass, and this kind of alleviates this from their suffering here on earth and purgatory. And so there's this great, which comes later within the next century of the church that we're talking about, this great hope to the poor souls in purgatory.